New York Judge Juan Merchan, who oversaw Donald Trump's hush money election interference trial, has denied Trump's bid to toss his guilty verdict. In his decision, Judge Merchan rejected the president-elect's argument that his conviction on 34 felony counts should be tossed on the grounds of immunity. Trump's legal team can appeal this ruling, ultimately all the way up to the Supreme Court. As the New York Times puts it today, quote, Mr. Trump manages to avoid all punishment whatsoever in his only criminal case to make it to trial. It would complete a stunning turnabout from earlier this year when he faced 4 indictments in 4 different jurisdictions. But if the ruling does stand, Trump could become the first felon to serve as president. We are back now with Lisa Rubin and Andrew Weissman. Did this surprise you at all?
No, it didn't. So this stems from a Supreme Court decision about presidential immunity. And there is one aspect of the decision, just to get super nerdy, is... I
also like the way, though, you referenced a Supreme Court decision on presidential immunity as though we and our audience might not be familiar with it, might not have breathlessly watched it.
So one aspect of that decision said that even when you've got a case that involves not official action, personal action by a president, which clearly the New York case was personal action, that there's a restriction on using official act evidence, that is evidence from the time that the president was the president acting as the president in his official capacity. And so Donald Trump, after that decision came out, said, OK, I scoured the record to find anything that happened during the time that he was president and made the claim this is all official act evidence. And so that's what Judge Merchan was relying on and ruling on. Notably about that Supreme Court decision, everyone thinks of that as a 6-3 decision. Amy Coney Barrett dissented from this part of the decision. So it is only 5-4, and it is by far the weakest part of that case. Now, 5-4 is still a decision, in Trump's favor. But if it were to go to the Supreme Court, there's more reason to think this would be a tough road for Donald Trump, because it's such a tenuous argument here. And Judge Merchan basically ruled every which way for the government on this. And just one quick thing that I thought he did, which was notable for the trial judge, is he said a lot of what Donald Trump complained about was evidence that Donald Trump himself put into the record. So you can't sit there and say, I elicited evidence that I thought would be helpful to me from the time I was president, but by the way, it was error to admit it.
But can't you do that if your purpose isn't actually to build a solid legal argument, but rather to build a political argument?
There's tons of, absolutely. There are 2 audiences to this brief. There's no question. There is a surprising amount, even for Donald Trump, of vituperative language that is, I'm sort of a buttoned-up lawyer, and even for me, it was really shocking. But as a pure legal matter, this is one where I think Judge Merchan, is correct and made so many alternative rulings. And as I said, is focusing on, I think, the weakest part of the Supreme Court decision.
Well, there are a lot of stops between here and the Supreme Court. So talk me through those.
Well, Lisa, I keep going back to, in your introduction, you were talking about if this conviction is sustained, he would be the first sitting president to also be a convicted felon. And I want to put an asterisk in that, because one of the options the DA's office has given to Judge Merchan in bringing this case forward is not only to stay the sentencing until Donald Trump is no longer president, but also to engage in something called abatement, which a number of states, not including New York, already do when a defendant, after a conviction but prior to sentencing, either dies or flees the jurisdiction. That would essentially leave the conviction in place, but Donald Trump would never proceed to a sentencing. And it's without that sentencing that he can't be what we would call a convicted felon. We can say Donald Trump was convicted of 34 felonies, but when lawyers talk about who constitutes a convicted felon, it usually refers to somebody who has already been through a sentencing process. It's possible that Donald Trump's conviction will stand. There will never be any sentencing. And then the question is, for whoever represents Donald Trump in the future, it likely will not be Todd Blanche, who's poised to become the number 2 at the Department of Justice, and Emil Bovee, who is likely to become his number 2 at the Department of Justice. Whoever represents Trump in the future has to then think about, are we going to appeal this if there is no sentence, or are we content to leave this in place? Donald Trump being Donald Trump, I don't think he's going to be content to leave it here.
Which of those choose your own adventures is best for accountability? Given the limited options that are now on the table?
I think the best for accountability is abatement. But again, New York law doesn't recognize abatement. So while it's very creative lawyering by the New York DA's office, they acknowledge in the brief where they set it forth as an option, basically, we're not one of the states where this is currently recognized, but this is a great option for you. I want to say something else about accountability, though, because we still have a number of civil judgments against the former and future president that have been rendered, and both of which are likely to be upheld at least in some way. Maybe the amount of money that Donald Trump is forced to pay in the end is not what was awarded by a judge or a jury, but I believe that the E. Jean Carroll verdicts will stand. I believe the New York Attorney General's verdict will stand, and Donald Trump will be forced to pay some quantum of tens of millions of dollars with respect to his former actions, even though they weren't necessarily actions he took as president.
You were making Andrew Weissman faces in the middle of that analysis.
I love Andrew Weissman's faces.
I was, because I think one option for Judge Merchan is to say, yes, there is a policy that a sitting president will not be subject to an indictment. That is temporary immunity. It's then sort of the idea of full immunity. That's a temporary period where the president gets to act just as president without worrying about a criminal case. That is not permanent immunity. And so the judge here could say, look, given the timeline, there's no time to get you sentenced before January 20th. So just practically, I can't do that. So I am going to stay this case, and that will happen after you are no longer immune, which is when you no longer are president, and you will be held just like anybody else to account. Imagine a situation where we were dealing with a murder. Would any of us sit there and say, oh, yeah, let's just, because somebody becomes president, let's just wipe that away and have no accountability? And here, the DA has very convincing arguments about why this is a serious crime. It is 34 felonies. Whatever the sentence is going to be, the sentence is going to be. That'll be up to Judge Merchan. And so the argument is treat him like anyone else post-presidency. And so you just put it off in keeping with the idea of temporary immunity.
It assumes that this is a presidency that lasts 4 years. Lisa Rubin, thank you so much for being with us. Andrew's going to be back with us in the next hour. And when we come back, just this morning, CNN unearthed clips of Hegseth on former House Speaker Newt Gingrich's podcast in the wake of the January 6th insurrection, peddling the completely baseless claim that leftist groups or Antifa staged a false flag operation at the Capitol.
And there are reports, in the New York Post and elsewhere, and just from, common sense, that Antifa folks took advantage of this to try to get to the front and try to agitate and create openings for themselves. They want chaos, ultimately. I could even spot it. You can see the helmets where there's a, Donald Trump bumper sticker on the back, quickly put on it so they could look like they wanted to stop the steal.
Again, and I know you know this, that is completely false. It has been debunked repeatedly, including by the outgoing Trump-appointed FBI director, Christopher Wray. Here's what he said just 2 months after the attack.
Has there so far been any evidence that the January 6th riot here, the insurrection, was organized by people simply posing as supporters of President Trump's?
We have not seen any evidence of that, certainly at this
Is there any evidence at all that it was organized or planned or carried out by groups like Antifa or Black Lives Matter?
We have not seen any evidence to that effect thus far in the investigation.
And is there any...
No evidence. But whatever right-wing narratives there are to excuse or whitewash the insurrection, well, Pete Hegseth has been happy to give them a platform. On that same podcast with Newt Gingrich, Hegseth downplayed and justified the attack. It led to several deaths, with more than 140 police officers injured.
I talked to the people on the mall. I've talked to them a lot. Listen, they believe the election was stolen. They wish there were more recourses. They've watched what happens. They've seen stories be suppressed before Hunter Biden, during and after, unwilling to air anything. I mean, the amazing extent to which the media has now taken to taking the official line of secretaries of states or governors and saying, well, this has been fact-checked and debunked because the government officials are telling us that it's not true. When's the last time that's what the media was supposed to do? Reflect and project back upon the populace what government officials are saying because it enhances their narrative. It's unbelievable. So the mindset of these people was not overtly radical. It wasn't violent at all.
his sympathies for those responsible for what the FBI director calls an act of domestic terrorism, adding to the many questions surrounding Hegseth's views. It's worth remembering he has been dogged by questions surrounding his support for extremism. Multiple outlets revealed just last month that Hegseth was deemed a potential insider threat and removed from a National Guard mission protecting President Biden's inauguration when an intelligence officer flagged a tattoo on his bicep with a battle cry that had been brandished on banners by Capitol rioters. Okay, meanwhile, the New York Times has new reporting on the man escorting Hegseth on Capitol Hill. His name is John Hasenbein, a former Army Special Forces Master Sergeant who attacked a civilian during a training exercise in 2019. The New York Times reporting that he, quote, beat a civilian role player, kicking him, punching him, and leaving him hogtied in a pool of his own blood. The Army charged Mr. Hasenbein with aggravated assault and reckless endangerment. A military jury found him guilty of the assault charge in a court-martial in 2020. That's according to Army records. But the judge overseeing the case declared a mistrial after learning that a friend of Mr. Hasenbein had been talking to a juror throughout the trial, court records show. Hasenbein told the New York Times, I have no conviction, and I was honorably retired after 22 years of service. That's all you need to know. An attorney for a firm that represented Hasenbein said that he agreed to retire rather than face another trial. For his part, Hegseth is standing by his security detail. Hegseth's lawyer, Timothy Parlatore, telling the New York Times that Hasenbein is, quote, a victim of unjust treatment by a broken military justice system. And that is where we start today with NBC News correspondent Vaughn Hilliard, who is in West Palm Beach for us. Also with us, former U.S. Senator and MSNBC political analyst Claire McCaskill, the CEO of Iraq and Afghanistan Veterans of America, retired Army Captain Allison Jaslow is here, and president of Media Matters for America, Angela Corazon. It is good to see you all. Vaughn, let's start with you. And Hegseth's comments, things we have heard him say about what happened on January 6th. Does Donald Trump, do people in Donald Trump's orbit see Hegseth's support for the Capitol rioters as a plus rather than a demerit?
For Donald Trump, he wants to know with his incoming administration, and chief among them, the individual who would lead his next Pentagon, the extent to which they would carry out the orders coming from the Oval Office come 2025 and beyond. And for Donald Trump, knowing Pete Hegseth was somebody who defended his actions, then President Trump's actions on January 6th, but also defended the rioters, the attackers who went in and stopped the peaceful transfer of power. For Donald Trump, this is, of course, a key component in finding somebody who he is, little question, would be able to serve in a capacity that he would see as sufficient. Because for Pete Hegseth, not only noting and suggesting that it was an inside job, that there was Antifa behind that attack today, we have known time and again that that is not the case. Even a recent DOJ IG report that came out just last week said that there were 4 FBI confidential human sources who were inside of the Capitol that day. But we're talking about thousands of attackers who were Trump supporters, individuals who have pleaded guilty and are even serving time for attacking the Capitol. And for Donald Trump, though, he has propagated over the years the idea that this was an inside job and that he had requested National Guard assistance that was denied, which, of course, is not accurate either. And so for Donald Trump, having Pete Hegseth, somebody who could potentially utilize the military for domestic purposes, as Donald Trump has suggested in the past he would seek to potentially do, this is a key litmus test in finding somebody who he had the utmost belief that he would carry out the duties that he would call on his Pentagon to carry out from the Oval Office.
Vaughn, I did not tell you the accusations against Hegseth, they keep mounting. What is the thinking at Mar-a-Lago regarding Hegseth, his chances of getting confirmed?
At this point in time, Donald Trump, he was at the Army-Navy game on Saturday alongside Pete Hegseth, and he has stood by his side here. It was Matt Gaetz who ultimately heard several affirmative no votes that led him to drop his efforts to be the Attorney General in the transition team, is still suggesting that Pete Hegseth has not been given an explicit no from any Republican senator at this point in time. So they intend to continue to move this forward. Of course, these one-on-one meetings meetings are important for him. And at the same time, Donald Trump has suggested that Republican senators up in 2026, like Joni Ernst, Bill Cassidy, Mike Rounds, they could all potentially face challengers, primary challengers in 2026 in this scenario that, in Donald Trump's terms, they were to unreasonably try to block any of his cabinet picks. So as of right now, there are no hard no's. And so at this point in time, Donald Trump and his transition team intend to proceed.
Right. I mean, there's Donald Trump himself, and then there's the hard push we are watching from broader MAGA allies to really get Hegseth into the Pentagon. Why make this the all-hands-on-deck mission?
For Donald Trump, this is a head nod to those who have affirmed loyalty to him and have given Donald Trump the word that they would intend to use their cabinet positions in the departments and agencies that they oversee to fulfill his orders. Donald Trump, I think we have to come back to during the campaign. I was told time and again that he would seek in 2025 to fill his cabinet out with individuals who would not be roadblocks to the executive use of power that he saw fit in his second go around as president. He blamed in 2017, 2018, much of the slowness in being able to effectuate the change that he so sought on having individuals serve in capacities as, for example, Secretary of Defense, Secretary of State, as well as other top leadership posts for his inability to effectuate the change that he desired. And by the time they got to 2020 with loyal allies that he felt were properly in these positions, the pandemic hit, and he placed much of the blame for their inability to effectuate that change on the pandemic at that point. So he time and again said that he wanted to make sure that he surrounded himself by people that he had the utmost belief in. And these nominees who he has announced over the course of these last weeks, they represent that. And Donald Trump, true to his word, is standing by them to the very end.
Vaughn Hilliard live for us in West Palm Beach. Vaughn, thank you for joining us. Thank you for your reporting. Allison, I want to look at all of this in the aggregate, the things that Hegseth has said about January 6th, the people he has decided to surround himself with. What message does it send to our men and women in uniform?
I think a couple of things. First of all, there are very concerning aspects of Hegseth's character, which, as you've noted, are being examined in one light today, but there have been multiple examples of concerning parts of, who he is just as a person and who he would then be as a leader of our men and women in uniform. But I think the thing that gets not enough attention is his active lobbying to get convicted war criminals pardoned. These are not war criminals who somebody went after from civilian society, but they were convicted because men who served alongside them and saw the horrors of war with them said that they crossed the line. And you have Navy SEALs that risked their careers to make sure that justice took place and that we held those service members to account, which the military really does well. And if we're going to elevate somebody into the role of Secretary of Defense who seemingly thinks war crimes are okay, that's a big problem. That's a big problem, not just for our men and women in uniform, but for our national security.
Claire, I'm not going to make you or our viewers listen to what Trump said about Pete Hegseth, but I'm going to just underline part of what I think is relevant, which is he said of Hegseth, he gave up a lot because he was going big places in Fox. I mean, I have as much reverence for cable news as anyone else, but it says something to me when you think that giving up a spot on cable news is the same as serving in what is the largest agency and leading the largest agency in the U.S. government. No?
Yeah, and listen, let me tee off what Allison was talking about. We can talk about Pete Hegseth's public drunkenness and what that says about his ability to be respected and serve and lead in this very important position. We can talk about his lack of qualifications running a very large and complex organization of millions and millions of people. We can talk about his attitude about women in the military, which frankly would decimate the strength of our military force if he tried to minimize the contributions of the women who serve and lose their lives for our country. But the military justice part is really important, as Allison said. Our military is an organization that depends on discipline. And the UCMJ, the Uniform Code of Military Justice, is riddled with requirements that must be put in place before someone is convicted under the Uniform Code of Military Justice. And as Allison said, the cases he's advocated for, including the guy he's hired as his security for this nomination process, that system depends on other members of the military testifying. If you don't believe me, ask Lindsey Graham. He was not only a defense lawyer in the military justice system, he was the chief prosecutor in Europe at one point in time in the military justice system. The idea that this guy wants to pretend that the military is woke and is not meting out appropriate punishment to people who violate that code that's a joke. It's almost as big a joke as saying the FBI is woke. Believe me, the military's problem is not that it's too woke. That is not an issue. We have a lot of problems that we need to deal with in the military, but that is not one of them. And that alone should get at least 4, if not 40 senators in the Republican Party to say no.
Angelo, your thoughts?
I mean, I think ultimately, to me, the tie-in here, as I look at all this, is that one of the things that Hegseth believes is that might makes right. And that's a very compelling argument to a lot of people, especially if you're going to try to transform or through brute force, our government and our culture. And I think that, even as the example of this person who's being his security guard, I mean, it's a symbol. He knows what he's doing. And that sort of ties in with this larger Hegseth fight, which is that if you're going to have a rising authoritarianism or any authoritarianism, a lot of it is theater. And Hegseth is a central character. And so for him, to me, the ingredients he brings is might makes right, which is terrifying. And we see that play out day to day. Fealty to Donald Trump, and that means that he's going to turn a blind eye or fully execute all the orders that Trump says, even if they're contrary to basic rules of law. And then the third part is his own agenda, which is to turn the Department of Defense, our military, into a flaming sword for Christ. This guy also has a worldview that has advocated for attacking, national and cultural heritage sites, that believes that you should kill civilians when they are Muslims, that's absolutely necessary, and that you're going to have to roll back a lot of the policies that have sort of softened up the military from what he describes as lethality, lethality, lethality. And that, to me, is the tie-in here, is that all these little stories that pop up, they're all grounded in this central idea that might makes right, and then, this underlying Christian nationalist worldview.
Allison, I want to make sure I get you on this new reporting in the Times about Hegseth's security escort. You had a former defense official telling the Times that it's, quote, not a good look. Allison, do you agree?
I totally agree. And I think the gentleman who was attacked in there saying that his, security detail is a guy who has anger issues is right on point. This was a training exercise. There's no reason why something like that should have gone down. And frankly, I'm kind of blown away that it was even able to happen. I would have thought that some of the other buddies there would have pulled him off of him pretty quickly, which to me says that it was a pretty aggressive pursuit and completely, you want to talk about things that are out of line in war. This was a training event. That was very out of line in a training event. And it sounds like, he was being held to account and something went sideways and they gave him an easy out. And he's able to hide behind that now. But, if we judge people by the company they keep, I think that says it all right there.
Angela, just real quick, when did working at Fox News become a qualification to run a major branch of the U.S. government?
I mean, for Trump, that's an important qualification because so much of what he sort of relies on is narrative dominance. And so if you're a media figure, that is sort of, the tip of the spear. In practice, it shouldn't be. And his only other relevant qualifications were when he ran organizations and he didn't do a very good job. But for Trump, we've seen this revolving door because ultimately, if you're a media figure, especially if you're a right-wing media figure, it means you can engage well. And that helps you not only build and rely on support, but it also means that you can then sort of control the story or shape the perception. And for Trump, perception is reality. And in a way, it's playing out, right? I mean, you would think that all these things would have toppled Hegseth so far, but because of the fact that he's a right-wing sort of, fever swamp, a creature of the fever swamps, he's been able to navigate this well. And that's when you sort of see Trump coming back around and saying, yeah, okay, you got my support.
Alison Jaslow, Angela Corazon, as always, thank you both so much for being with us. Claire McCaskill, you are sticking with us. When we come back, new charges unsealed in the last hour involving Luigi Mangione, the 26-year-old suspect in the deadly shooting of a health insurance CEO in New York City earlier this month. What he could be facing when he comes back to New York. Plus, with Donald Trump set to take office in just a few short weeks, Vice President Kamala Harris is urging voters, specifically young ones, to remain optimistic and to not give up the fight. We're going to show you some of that speech. And later in the show, how the president-elect plans to, quote-unquote, straighten out the press. All those stories and more when Deadline White House continues.
Let me say this plainly. There is no heroism in what Mangione did. This was a senseless act of violence. It was a cold and calculated crime that stole a life and put New Yorkers at risk. We don't celebrate murders, and we don't lionize the killing of anyone. And any attempt to rationalize this is vile, reckless, and offensive to our deeply held principles of justice.
Just in the last hour, Manhattan District Attorney Alvin Bragg announcing the indictment of Luigi Mangione for the murder of United Healthcare CEO Brian Thompson outside the Hilton Hotel in Midtown on December 4th, 2024. Mangione has been charged with 1 count of first-degree murder in furtherance of terrorism, 2 counts of murder in the second degree, one of which is charged as an act of terrorism, as well as a number of criminal charges related to weapons possession. Let's bring in MSNBC legal correspondent Lisa Rubin, also with us, former top prosecutor at the Department of Justice, and MSNBC legal analyst Andrew Weissman. All right, Lisa, walk us through these charges.
So, Alicia, as you just noted, the majority of the charges here actually stem from the possession of the gun and related paraphernalia. There are 7 different gun charges here, and they don't seem to be in the alternative to each other, meaning he could be independently convicted of each of these 7 gun charges. Where it comes to the murder charge, though, I think the first one is the most interesting and the one designed to really carry the most punch, and that's a murder in the first-degree charge. So in New York, unlike other jurisdictions, premeditated murder is not first-degree murder in New York. It generally requires a plus factor. You try to murder a police officer, for example, or you murder the witness to a crime who you know is about to testify. Farther down on the list in the New York statute is that you commit a murder in furtherance of terrorism or an act of terrorism. And that's how Luigi Mangione was charged here. And I just wanted to focus in on what it means to commit a murder in furtherance of an act of terrorism, because the statute defines it and the indictment parallels the language. It says that you are essentially carrying out a murder, a premeditated murder, meaning you know that you're going to carry out this murder in advance, either to intimidate civilians, to influence policy of a unit of government through intimidation or coercion, or to affect the conduct of government by murder or another major crime. And here, what I found interesting about the press conference was that it seemed as if the New York City Police Commissioner, Jessica Tisch, in talking about the reaction to the crime, was attempting to bolster that terrorism charge, right? And explaining to people this was cold, this was calculated, this was designed to scare people. That is a way of sort of surrounding the charges here with a buffering or a cushion of language about that terrorism charge. Whether they can prove that Luigi Mangione intended to have that effect is a wholly separate question, and one that is really going to put prosecutors, I think, to their paces. That having been said, we don't know the plethora of evidence at their disposal. We don't know much of what he left behind electronically. We have seen maybe a snippet of some of his writings, and it will matter what he said about his intent to murder Brian Thompson and for what purpose if they are going to succeed on this first-degree murder charge.
Lisa's mind went exactly where mine did, which is how do you prove that the intent was in fact terrorism?
Yeah, so normally in what I would say is a traditional or true terrorism case, somebody is in Al-Qaeda or ISIS, and there's something like the Boston bombing that happens, which is not an Al-Qaeda, but it's there's an actual repeated bombing in a very public setting, killing and hurting scores of people. So there it sort of speaks to itself. I mean, you have that. Here, when you've got an isolated event where there doesn't appear, again, we don't know, as Lisa said, what all the evidence is. It doesn't appear that he was actively publicizing this and using it to engage in some sort of message to the government. It's going to be less clear. The one thing that is that although on paper it appears to be a bit of a reach from what we have seen, like the public evidence doesn't seem to support that. And again, as Lisa's right, we don't know. Privately, he was saying all sorts of things. The government doesn't have to prove that to get a conviction, because they will say they want a lesser included charge. So when you charge first degree, you will give the jury the option of saying, you know what, if we don't prove terrorism, you can find just plain old murder. And you know what, for a murder charge, if they get a conviction, and this seems like a very strong case for that, that you would still get a lot of time. My sort of mind is not so much to the terrorism piece, because I thought that seemed a little bit of a stretch from what we know. It's more, are we going to hear from the defense about mental health issues? And I don't mean that in any way in a disparagement, and I also don't mean it as an excuse, but as an explanation. What we've seen publicly is such an erratic sort of amalgam of smart things and sort of things that you wouldn't expect a smart criminal to do. Going to Starbucks beforehand, still having a lot of the evidence on you days after the arrest, seem inconsistent with somebody who also clearly knew where the victim was going to be, planned that, figured out how to escape. I mean, so it just seems like it might be some grounds for a mental health defense, or at least with respect to sentencing, raising that. So I think that's something to keep an eye out for.
Lisa, you get last word, but I am curious where this goes from here.
I think, certainly we should expect to see Luigi Mangione in New York sooner than later. Before you came to air, we now have reportable that Luigi Mangione is going to waive extradition from Pennsylvania. And so given that, and given who his lawyers are here, we understand that he's represented by Karen Friedman Agnifilo, who is the former, essentially #2 in the Manhattan DA's office, which is now prosecuting this crime. I would expect that we'll see Luigi Mangione make his first